John faction of the Dominican Labour Party very seriously indeed. They were very angry because of the way that it had been, the government had changed. And so there was always this feeling of resentment against the Eugenia Charles and the Dominica Freedom Party, that they had got into power in a violent way, if you want. The other thing is that in the early days of the Freedom Party, Eugenia Charles realized, and even towards the end of the Patrick John era, that there were certain problems emerging within the Defense Force. The whole report was done on the Defense Force. There was questions of the loss of firearms, and perhaps also in the report there was reference to marijuana trading and stuff like this. And so what Eugenia Charles did is she took all the guns from the Defense Force and put them in the police station. And then the Defense Force protested. They came up to her office one lunchtime. Everybody had gone for lunch. I was in my office next door in GIS because I was
Press secretary.
And all of a sudden I hear these people banging on Miss Charles's door, on Dame Eugenia's door. She wasn't Dame Eugenia yet. And I went out, and there was Frederick Newton and others, Reed and others banging on the door trying to break it. Now what, she had seen them coming, and so she locked her door because she was alone. Anyway, police came and the whole thing dissipated. But then she decided to simply abolish the Defense Force. So here were all these guys out of a job. They had this privileged position. And she said that Dominica did not need a defense force, that there would be a special service unit within the police that would be responsible for matters.
Interesting.
So naturally, these guys were very
They were upset.
And there was brewing this coup to overthrow the Eugenia Charles government. Now, an entire book has been written about it, called The Bayou of Pigs, by a Canadian journalist called Stewart. So I won't go into too much detail because you're talking about me.
That's all right.
That's
Yes,
so
for sure.
So what was beginning to happen was there was this plan that these mercenaries were going to come from Louisiana, and they would land on the beach by Rockaway and other places, and they would join with dreads in the hills that had been trained by the discomfited members of the Defense Force. And one unit of these were being trained up behind my father's place, in a place called Béline, underneath Mont Anglais. Because I went up by my father the weekend before, and I heard these shots in the mountain. Pa, pa, pa. I said, but Daddy, what's happening? He says, I really don't know, but there's some funny thing going on. And certain Defense Force men were seen going up and through the forest and going and linking with these people. Nobody quite knew what was going on. And then Miss Charles dreamed up something which really, I think, was what broke the whole thing. She decided that something must be done. She didn't quite know what was happening, but it was something that was being planned. And at that time, Seaga was the Prime Minister of Jamaica. They were very good friends. And she asked Seaga for a bazooka. And she got 2 officers from the Dominica Police Force to be trained to fire this bazooka. And her plan was that it would destroy the camp, and that would be the end of that gang. Well, there's one of the officers who's still alive, so I won't mention his name, but the other one was Inspector Bannis, who has since died. He was in charge of the whole operation. And what had happened at the same time is the guys had come in from the forest, and they had broken into the shop at Girardel. Now, my father was a member of the Girardel Village Council, and he was president of the cooperative shop. There was a cooperative shop. And they broke into the shop and they stole a whole set of stuff. Well, naturally, he had to report to police. Now, there was a feeling that within the police force, there was some contact with the guys in the forest. The person who was suspect has since died. But somehow these guys got the information. And when on the morning of the 12th of February 1981, these police went with this bazooka. but they placed it in the wrong way and they didn't fire the right way.
They were not properly trained.
Or in the circumstances of 4 o'clock in the morning,
Things went
they
awry.
panicked and things went awry. In any case, about 3 guys were killed. But the fury of those who were not killed then turned on my father, so that by lunchtime, they just surrounded the house. They shot the dogs, and my father came out, and they held him up. His wife, he was married second time, Penny, and the guy who was doing the garden and the groundsman, Mr. Donovan, and the woman who cooked and so the helper, all of them were rounded up. And then Zai, Eric Joseph, who sits in Newtown, he and others took gasoline from my stepmother's car and sprayed the gasoline on the house. Now was an entirely wooden house. And then lit it. And in lighting it, you know what happens when you light gasoline? It goes up. And it kicked back and burnt his leg. And up to today you will see him with a bandage around the leg. It has never quite cured. And then they took all of them out into the bush up behind, almost by Baleen, on the ravine that goes the Walhouse River. And they forced my father to write a note, a note to tell the government that they would not release him until they had freed certain guys in the prison and that they stopped tormenting certain people, etc. And then they sent my stepmother, Penny, and the 2 others away and told them, go and give this to the Prime Minister. Well, panicked, they rushed to the forest, they went up to Girardel. People in Girardel had seen the fire. They didn't know what was going on, they thought they were dead. When they reached up there by the school in Girardel, there's Father Werner, who you remember Father Werner, and he is the only person that had a vehicle at that time. And they told him, please take us to Roseau, take us to the police station. So Father Werner himself was terrified. He was saying, Hail Mary, full of grace, all the way, my stepmother said, all the way to Roseau. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord be with us. All the way, and they finally got to the police station. By that time, I had seen Nicholas George, who is a retired police officer, great partner of mine, because he really went there with some other officers while the house was burning, and he saved my father's vehicle, a pickup. So when I saw the pickup, I went by DBS to find out more. I was in my office working, and Judith Pestena phoned me and said, Lennox, did you hear that your house is burning up in Girardel and your father has been taken? I said, no, I don't know anything about it. So I left, I went by DBS. Next thing I see this vehicle coming up with Nicholas George driving it. I said, what's happened? Did you see their bodies in the fire? And so he said, no, I don't think their bodies are in the fire. I think they took them. So then I went to police headquarters. By this time, Miss Charles and other ministers of government are coming in to have meetings and so. My stepmother is in panic. So that night now, Father Werner took her to the presbytery and she slept the night in the Roseau Presbytery, and the next morning they got her out and she flew out of Dominica to Antigua. So I was left with all of them. Nobody knew what was happening. We didn't even dare go up to the house because rumors were running like nobody's business. And eventually we found out after many months that he had actually been killed that very night.
The same night in question.
Taken him to Baleen and they had him under guard. Now, my father is an agriculturalist and he always carried a penknife in his pocket, a penknife that you use for budding plants. So it had a hook penknife with a hook blade. And they hadn't searched him or anything, and this was in his pocket. And he was being guarded by one of the guys.
Was it one of the Dread?
Yes, one of the Dread guys, one of the group, one of the gang, who had raided the place and all that.
Was that gang, may I ask, also made up of the former Defense Force guys?
No, they had been trained
They were trained by them.
But they were not made up of them.
All right.
One of the leader of the gang was a guy called Pocossion, Leroy Etienne. And he had been in prison for previous murders. He was on remand for other murders. But Hurricane David struck. opened up the prison, and it was the decision by the interim government was in by then, and a decision was taken to free some of these people, like Desmond Trotter was in there, and Etienne and the others. So their whole past, that is it, I'm not equating Desmond Trotter. Desmond Trotter was nothing to do with that at all. It just so happened he was in the prison
at the time.
So what happened is that then that Pocosion was out again. So it's Pocosion that was leading this gang. If he had been kept in prison, he would not have been out to do this. And you see, Pocosion was a psychopath. Pocosion just loved death. The amount of people he killed. And he killed people even after my father. When they went and crossed up into the back Wobisson, up behind Mont Prospect, they took Eden Bellot, who was up there, and they cut his neck off with a chainsaw. You know? That was in the weeks and days after my father's murder. So, so he took my father, took his penknife, and...
Your father took his penknife?
Out of his pocket, in the middle of the night, he thought, well, I'm going to have a chance to escape. And he held the guard, and he cut his neck. Now, the guard was Zai.
You mean he killed him?
He killed him.
He killed the guard, your father?
The guard, yes. So Eric Joseph, that was Eric Joseph's brother. So my father started to run. Now it's night. You're going down a ravine. There are huge boulders and stones. So, of course, I mean, he was weak. He hadn't had lunch. He hadn't had anything. 58 years old, which I am older than him now, so I consider that to be young. And then they cornered him. And they beat him to a pulp. This is the report of one of the guys who turned state witness. He was the cook. He was not involved with...
Dreads?
No, he was not involved with the attack on the house.
Okay.
But he was there observing.
Okay.
And then the final thing at the end, because he had killed Zai's brother, Zai fired a shot and smashed his brains out, smashed his entire skull. And then they put his body in a bag, and they got a boucan of wood fire, and they burnt his body in the forest. And they left, and they started to go across underneath Mont Anglais and across by Mont to the back by Dalis. Now remember, Eric Joseph Zai has been injured by the fire that he set and burning our house.
Right.
So he slipped in a ravine behind Dalis, and they didn't wait for him and they didn't go back for him. He was slowing them down, and they let him slide down in the ravine. And they continued around to Bells, and they began to block traffic that was going to the airport. So Miss Charles now sent a police delegation in a bus and to attack and kill. They killed some, injured some. Others went in the forest, and we have not heard of them since. But meanwhile, a farmer from Dalis, going to his garden, heard this bleating. He thought it was at first a goat. Bleating. When he looked down in the ravine, he saw this guy. I mean, the whole dread thing, the gangrene was smelling. It was terrible because the foot had become infested with maggots and things like that. So he dragged him out and put him on the road. By this time, it's well into March, April. And they dragged him, they got an ambulance, put him in the ambulance, and they brought him into the yard of the police station. And when they opened the ambulance, people just pulled back because of the smell that was coming out. And then they cleaned him up, and a day later, I went with Blanchard, the chief of police. I went to the ward in the hospital. And when he saw me, he kind of shook, his eyes open wide, because I look quite a lot like my father.
I see.
So when he saw me, the memory of all of this came back. And then eventually he issued a statement about what happened, which he later denied. He don't know anything about that or whatever. And then they basically stabilized him. and then eventually he was put in prison, and there was a court
Trial?
case. The trial was in 1983, and of course he was sentenced to hang, but he never was hanged. He was put in prison, and basically for 27 years, and up in within recent memory that he has been released.
The Mercy Committee.
So now he is in Newtown, and he turned against the very people who were helping him, the Nyambingi and so. When he came out, they assisted him because he had learned tailoring in prison, and they assisted him with sewing machine and various things, a place to live. He turned against his own family. I suppose mentally the kind of thing he had been through. And today, he's there in Newtown.
But
And it's very difficult whenever anybody in Dominica says, you know, every so often there's a murder, and people say, oh, it should be hanged. Well, I simply smile gently because I know that if they couldn't hang Eric Joseph for what he did to my father, destroyed everything I had, because that night I only had the clothes on which I was dressed in. And all my books, all my papers, all my possessions had been burnt at Gromie Girardel.
I want to ask you though, Doc. Joseph appeared to be the one who was tried and convicted.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as you know, did he operate? He did not operate alone. Were there others?
Well, I explained. There were others who beat him up. There were others who went and burned their
But
house.
they were never found out.
No, because by that time they were dead. He was the lucky one, because by being saved, by being taken to the hospital, by being put in prison, he was not out and about. And I believe, I speak under correction, that bit by bit, they were just picked off in the forest.
Okay.
And by the time 1983 came, all of them were dead. There was rumors about Pocosion made it to Martinique and all that kind of thing.
But you don't think so?
I don't think so.
Let me ask, Doc, as it is today, I want to ask you your views on capital punishment. What do you think? Do you think that people...
Well, at the time, I mean, you can understand. I just wanted this person out. You know, I wanted hanging to take place. And ministers of government at the time didn't do what they had to do and all this kind of thing. I know them today. I watch these people today. I know them. But as time wore on, I said to myself, perhaps it is worse. Because really and truly, when you're dead, boom, that's the end of it. But to continue to live and to live in abject poverty and pressure and be rejected by people, sometimes that is worse than just being cut off. And for me, it really hurts to drive through Newtown. I know that's my father's murderer. I know what he did, because he himself, I took my aunt, who is 93 years old, and another aunt, and I stopped by him. And he talked to them, and they asked him questions. Why did you do this? He said, you must understand the times and what was going on and all this kind of business. I mean, they cried and all that. But I said, well, if you all want to speak to this man, this is the man that murdered your brother, you know.
Forgiveness? Have you forgiven?
I mean, you try to forget. But the thing is that you pass this person, and as soon as you see the person,
The memory comes
back. And it's the way of the death, to be beaten until all your bones are broken, and then to have your brains blown out to the point where and burnt, so that when they came to find the remains, only some of the brain bones around the skull were remaining. And then that was sent to Scotland Yard in England, and they worked out all the links to my father.
Prove that it was him.
It was him, and so on. So that appeared in court and everything like that.
You're able to talk about it today, Doc, and still, remain strong.
It's a long time. It's 1981 to now is over 30 years. But every so often, when you meditate and you think about it, and you know how terrible it is. And what makes it worse is that he was such a kind man. And
I was
he
told
did so much for people. Eric Joseph.
I was told he was actually friends with some of those
Let me tell
guys.
you, Hurricane David, right? In the midst of Hurricane David, Zai was not among them because Zai was somewhere else. But the others, in the midst of Hurricane David, they arrived on my father's doorstep. Tutuni, nothing. He took towels from his cupboard and he gave them each a towel to wrap around themselves. And they stayed until the evening time when the storm had abated a bit, and then they left. I mean, you know, these are people that he had assisted. But not only that, I mean, he was well known for all his participation in bananas and farmers and all these things. And, you know, people, helping people within the Girdell community and Newtown, Citronet, and so people were in shock, you know. And it just shows you do all these things for people and you never know how you're going to end up.
Is that the lesson learned from this?
The lesson I learned from it and the way in which it gives me comfort is that the plot, that is the plot to overthrow the government, was not supposed to happen then. It was planned for Carnival Monday night of Carnival 1981. And all the things were going to come. They were going to murder the members of cabinet. They were going to find them, whether they were in Maho, Belfast, Miss Charles over in Wallhouse, and they were going to murder the cabinet and take over the government. How they expected to run the government, I don't know. It's like when Bernard Cord went and directed the execution of Morris Bishop and all of these people. How did Bernard Cord expect to run Grenada? So if they overthrew the government like that and killed members of cabinet, how are they going to operate and run Dominica, you know? So one thing that can be a comfort is that, okay, my father died, my house was destroyed, my possessions were totally destroyed. But this created an alarm that forestalled the coup. But it was resurrected again in December of 1981 when they attempted to free Patrick John from prison, and P.C. Alexander was killed, and other members of the former defense force like Benjamin and Piper, they were killed, and so on. So.
Your sources of information from all of this would have come from whom?
All the court transcripts are there, and also the police reports, that is the questioning of the police. For instance, my stepmother and all the people who were present, they had to give the police an account. But key to the trial was this one guy, Maxime, who said he was the cook. And he was not at Community. He had stayed in the camp. And then he eventually said exactly what had happened on the night. So,
have you written about any of this? Aspect of your life?
I put that kind of in a composite short version in the Dominica story. So in the history of the island, the Dominica story. But
for you personally?
Not really. I mean, I haven't done a study. In fact, I don't think I ever will.
Okay.
Because sometimes
with reason.
Too painful to go into.
Where is your mind and your heart today, Doc, where this entire experience of your life is concerned?
Well, you know, actually what has made it a bit easier is the whole history part. Because when you reflect, okay, it's a terrible case for you personally, but when you reflect, there have been terrible things that have happened in Dominica, you know, over the years and in the past and whatever. And this is just another of them. And they fade into history.
Okay.
For you personally, it's a personal anguish. Yeah? But then when you add them up with all the other things that have happened, and people killing people, and the terrible punishments back in the 18th century and whatever, you put it together with all of this, so that in a way, you try to calm your personal experience. But out of it came some amazing things. I remember the day after this happened, you know, I was like, the only thing that the word best used is the Creole word désolé. Désolé, where do I go? I have no home to go to.
You were lost.
I was lost. My mother was living in the middle of Roseau. She only had a one bedroom. I just went up Federation Drive and I just walked into a house. I knew the people. This is Dr. Bernard and Mrs. Sorrento. I just walked in and I said, can I have a bed just to lie down, you know? And of course they said, yes, certainly. And so
They fed you and
they fed me, and Dr. Sorrento gave me that pill, you know, you take to cool
sleep?
nerves. Yes. And Valium. Yeah. And I stayed there for almost, you know, maybe 3 months or so. But I knew them, but I didn't know them well. But I just felt, man, I need some place because everybody's on my case. Everybody's around me. I am the one taking the pressure for all of this. And I must say, you know, I mean, up to today, Althea Sorrento, she always hugs me and she says, my son, and so. Because that was a experience of true Christian kindness and service,
compassion,
and so, you know, it's like the Bible says, you know, about the Good Samaritan, you take the person in. And I'm sure that there are many people, if I had ended up on their doorstep like that, they would have done the same. But it just so happened those are the people that I went to. And